Trying to at least keep myself centered. Bum bum bum. 3, 2, 1. Hi guys, and welcome to the third episode of the Black Lodge podcast, Adventures in Online Learning. I am, as always, your host, Mark Sheridan, and today we're just going to touch on a couple of topics that I think are worth considering before you start recording your lectures. I want to talk a little bit about starting strong, so how to open your presentations, your lectures. Then I want to talk a little bit about trying to avoid editing where possible. And then I just want to mention a few things about being yourself and, where possible, watching the kind of language that you use. For those of you who are watching this podcast in the video version, I apologize for my very tired state. My 11-month-old daughter is in the process of getting, I'm not sure, her 5th tooth, I think. And apparently there are over 20 of these to come, so tiredness is rampant. But the show must go on, so let's get on to our first topic, starting strong. I'm not sure what it is about recording yourself on video or audio that seems to change people's natural behaviors. I think it's a fear of not looking perfect, but also I think it's some kind of ingrained notions from television and radio from years long since past, where people come in and start in an overly formal way. When you're giving your lectures and presentations, you should be much closer to how you do it in an actual lecture theatre as opposed to what you would imagine someone who's on the 6 o'clock news would say. You don't need to come in and say, "Hello, my name is Professor blah blah blah, and today I'm going to talk to you about..." I just don't think that's what you do when you walk into a classroom. So instead, I would say start strong. If you can, start with an interesting piece of information, a fact, a metaphor, an analogy. If you can come in and say, "Did you know that 1 in 3 children living in poverty will die under the age of 5? Suddenly people stop and listen. If you can say that startups that follow these 3 key points have a 60% higher success rate, you've got people listening, and that's what you want. Now, obviously, not every lecture has an interesting fact that you can start with, but that's where metaphors and analogies can really come into play. It's just anything that allows us to build some sort of a mental model, some sort of a structure to comprehend the basic ideas that you're going to be bringing into our head over the next 20, 30, 40 minutes. What you're trying to do is make people curious. Basically, it's a way of welcoming people into the information. If you can make them curious, it opens up their ears, it opens up their minds, and they're going to come into your lecture ready and deliberately trying to learn the information you're sharing. What they need to do to understand what you're talking about is they need to understand why it's important. So even if the materials you're going to be dealing with can be quite dry or are not particularly overexciting, if you can explain to them that these core concepts, these fundamentals, while dry in their own right, form the basis of much more interesting and complex models we're going to be looking at later on in the course, people will understand and they'll give you that bit of leeway. They won't mind if this stuff's a bit tougher because they now know why it's important for them to learn it. And with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about one of my personal bugbears, and that is learning outcomes. Now, if at all possible, I would try and persuade you to never read out your learning outcomes either in an intro video or at the very beginning of a presentation. I've yet to meet an academic or a speaker or presenter who really does this in real life, so I'm not sure why it's crept into our online community. It seems to have found a way into traditional templates. And I'm not saying learning outcomes aren't important. They are. They're very important. Knowing what you need to communicate and exactly what has to go into a class is very, very important. What I'm saying is the students don't need to know. Like when you watch the beginning of a film, they don't come on and say, by the end of this, you will know that this guy did this murder and this is how he got away with it. That's not important at this stage. All we need to know now is why we should pay attention and why this is interesting. It's very hard for anyone to actually even remember or recall these learning outcomes when you present them to people before they've learned the information, because you can't really remember something that you haven't learned yet. So if you mention the name of some kind of a model or case study and the people don't know what it is, it's very hard for a brain to lock onto that and know where to file that in their head. So unless it's connected to something that they've already learned, it would be much more appropriate to bring these things up at the end of the lesson, after people have gone over and studied, say, two particular different structural models. Then you can say, those two we discussed, it's really important that you're able to compare and contrast those and say why one is better than the other. That's the right place for that. But at the beginning, if you start telling people stuff that they can't understand, it's permission to switch off. And this kind of rolls nicely into the whole reality of trying to be yourself, trying to keep as much as possible that natural flow and speaking pattern that you would use in a live environment. There's a tendency, because we're recording something, to try and phrase things more formally or more perfectly, if that's what people think perfect is. But the danger with that is you end up with something that's actually more sterile. And in an online environment, the major casualty is actually that direct human-to-human connection that we have. So what you don't want to do is actually further remove that. The video and the audio you use to communicate with your audience, with your students, is actually the one human connection that we have left. So it's really, really important that we try to keep as much of you and your personality and your attitude into it as possible. The slides have all the information, the supporting notes have all the information. What we need with you, what we need to learn is your teaching style. Computers can never replicate or replace the value of a human connection. So, as I've mentioned before, every electronic device we use is full of every single bell and whistle you can imagine to try and steal our attention and distract us. So what we have to do here is keep the audience engaged, and we do that by being real human beings. So what you're actually trying to do is keep your natural rhythm and talk patterns and phrases that you would use in a real environment. Do not try and make yourself perfect. Don't try and make your presentation a perfectly structured, cold and clinical thing. Make it as human as possible. I'm sure I've said it before, but it's worth reiterating that when you're speaking, whether you're recording your audio or making a video to your audience, remember that it's not like in a classroom where you're speaking to a room full of 10, 20, 500 people. In this scenario, you've got a new relationship. Usually there's only one person who's sitting there watching a video or watching a presentation. So instead of orating out to a larger room, you're now talking to one person. So it's important that you adjust the tone of your voice down to that. So you're talking directly to one person. So while you're recording yourself, picture that person sitting in front of you and you're sharing this information. You're not talking at them, you're talking to them. You're helping them understand. That's the tone, that's the volume. It's a little bit more conversational. I'm a big advocate of doing a good outline to what you plan to cover in a lecture. I think bullet points, key phrases are great things to have to guide you to make sure you stay on track and get all that information in to satisfy those learning outcomes that you've set in place. I prefer these to a formal script because, well, firstly, it takes a lot longer to write a formal script and you are honestly not going to have the time for that. But it also means that you're going to use your natural thought process to fill in the gaps between them, and it frees your mind up to have little asides, to bring in that additional information that you know, much like you do in a presentation in real life. The worst thing you can do is sit there and just read the bullet points on your slides. They're already up on screen. People can read them. They don't need you to read for them. So what you're there for is actually to bring some color to that, some extra details and descriptions to bring life to it. That when you're going over it, even if you're reading a line exactly as it's written on screen, where you emphasize the words will tell people a lot about what's important and what's not. And by finding your natural flow, you'll be amazed how much more natural you're going to come across on screen, on the audio. Whether you're seeing your face on camera or not, what I would say is try and relax your shoulders. Try and give yourself the freedom and permission to move a little bit like you do in person. If you're someone who's quite expressive, even if you're only recording audio, allow your hands to move, allow your shoulders to move, your body, your head. Obviously, if you're on camera, you have to stay slightly more in frame, but it's important that you allow your body to move, because that's when we get into our natural flow of things. And that's when you'll create the natural type of lectures that you've been delivering to your students for years already. And with that in mind, I want to bring up the idea of editing in an online environment. Obviously, the great thing about being in an online environment is you have more control than you would have ever had before about how your material goes out there, how it looks, how it sounds. You can tweak things afterwards. But just because you can doesn't mean that you should. Don't try and make yourself perfect. It's absolutely fine to have made mistakes, or to fluff a word or a sentence, or even say something wrong. Do exactly like you would in a normal lecture or presentation. You would just correct yourself. You'd acknowledge it, you'd correct it, or maybe you have to look something up and you say, well, actually, hold on a second till I just check that, look it up, confirm it, and carry on. There's two benefits to this. The first one is it takes longer to record presentations than it would if you just walked into a lecture theatre. Because of that, you're already going to find yourself tight for time, especially as you're adjusting to this new environment and just getting used to the new technology or whatever else it is that you're using. So you do not need to add to your workload in any way, shape, or form. And editing takes time. It seems simple, but it's just not as basic as you'd imagine, and it can bring up more issues and problems. Now, as you get better at these things, of course, you get quicker at them. But for now, I would say go into everything with the aim of having to do no editing. And if you have to do anything, try and limit to 2 or 3 things. Like, really only remove something if it's seriously egregious. And I'd actually argue the only time you should need to edit is if you've to add something in afterwards that you forgot to do. And even in that situation, I would say don't try and cut it perfectly into the presentation to pretend you didn't miss it. Actually just record it as an additional bit and put it at the end and just say, you know what, I just remembered there was something else I wanted to mention and it's this, explain it, and then that's the end of that. Treat it like a normal thing, like if you're walking out of the room and you're like, oh, I completely forgot to mention this, and then go through it. And in a strange way, that lack of perfection is going to be much more engaging to your students. They're going to actually connect much more with you because they see that you're a human being. The thousands and millions of years of evolution that we've faced mean that we connect with real reactions from people. We don't really trust people who are perfect because something about it isn't right. And because we have this new barrier between us in this online world, it's really nice to keep that humanness in it. In fact, I can't remember the paper that I read, but there was something about that people who made more errors or acknowledged them, that the audience engaged more because they felt sympathy for them, and they actually trusted them more because they felt that they were being honest, they were being real. To be more human is to be more endearing. And don't worry if you speak a little bit slowly or a little bit quickly. Like, really, it's about leaning into your natural flow. So I'm not saying deliberately speak slowly or deliberately speed up, but go with whatever your natural pace is. And the reason for this is it will match the tone and the style of information that you present. Speaking slower isn't necessarily speaking boring, if that's your style and approach, because what it does is it forces people to focus in. Whenever someone starts talking slower about something, we tend to assume that it's quite important. So we open up our ears a bit more. And when people speak quicker, actually, the research tends to show that people concentrate a bit harder because they're forced to pay attention because the information is coming at them a little bit quicker. So obviously, you don't want to speak too fast, especially if you've got students where English isn't their first language, but don't be worrying about changing the way you speak. Really, the more natural you are, the better. The very worst thing you can actually do is speak in a slow, dry, monotone voice. There's nothing that will lose an audience quicker than not fluctuating your voice at all. Because you come across as bored and you are directly sending out a message to the other people that you don't find this information interesting. And if you don't find it interesting, the odds of other people finding it interesting are very, very low. When you think back to school yourself and who were your favorite teachers, who were the ones who had the impact on you, they're the ones who cared about what they taught. They're the ones who seemed to have some sort of a passion for it. And before we wrap up, I just want to touch on the whole watching your language. Now, I'm not saying don't curse, though I'm sure most institutions probably would discourage those kind of things. In fact, I'm quite proud that this podcast still has a clean ratings on iTunes, because for anyone who knows me, that's quite a miracle if I've gotten through at least 2 episodes already without cursing. But when I say watch your language, what I actually mean is more the words you use and the impact it can have on the people who are listening. If you say to people, I hope you find this interesting, or try to learn these things, these words don't give us the sense of confidence that they should. If you only hope that I find this interesting, it makes me believe that you're not sure that I will. If you can tell me directly, this is very interesting, or if you're not sure that I'm going to find it interesting, saying, you may not find this interesting right now, but I promise you what you're going to learn later in the year will always connect back to this. And in the same sense, when someone says like, try and learn this later on, like try doesn't really mean do. We've all tried to follow our New Year's resolutions. We've all tried to do a lot of things. It's almost permission to not complete the task. But if you can say to someone that if you learn these 5 core values, you are going to find the rest of the year so much easier. If you can tell people direct statements and tell them why it's useful, it will change how they take in the information. What they want from you is the confidence that you believe in this material, and because of that, they can believe in it. Okay guys, that's us done for this week. I hope you found the podcast interesting. If you did, please, if you haven't already, like and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. We're on Spotify, Google Podcasts, pretty much anywhere you can find podcasts. And of course, you can watch the video of the podcast on our YouTube channel, The Black Lodge, where I've also been putting up a bunch of videos walking you through the basics of camera, sound and video. There's a video up there about using capture cards to connect cameras to your computer. We're going to be going over a lot of different teacher style tech that I think can just really help you guys ramp up and improve the quality of your materials for this coming academic year. Talk to you next week, guys. Thanks.